Robo Daiyusha. Hey guys, what's cracking? Godspan here, coming at you with another deck profile. Today we're going to be talking about the highly anticipated Dimensional Robo ride line that's releasing in DZBT03 Dimensional Transcendence. This is one of the most hype encounter ride lines ever released. Of course, there are going to be a lot of Overlord fans, and who doesn't remember the iconicity that is PBL and MOB and so on and so forth. But when it comes to encounter ride lines, so many people have been desperately anticipating the arrival of Daiyusha, and so he is here in all of his glory. And I must say, Bushiroad did him justice, guys. This deck is so freaking fun. So much so that despite not being a Brant goon nor a Dimensional Police goon, I had to do a deck profile talking about why Daiyusha is one of the funnest decks out there, and also some of the genuine strength that this deck brings to the table in the format, because I do believe that while it's not going to be a top tier meta contender, it will still be a very viable rogue strategy. Now, forgive me because I'm not going to have this be a scripted deck profile. I kind of tapered off on the scripts because it means that I can release these a bit faster and also just have more of my genuine, unfiltered opinions in discussing these card choices. But despite that, I hope you can forgive, because I'm going to make some stutters and some ums and so on and so forth. It's just human nature to make those kind of grammatical mistakes. That said, let me go ahead and give you the general breakdown of how this deck profile is going to go. I'm going to go over my card choices for the deck, obviously, but then afterwards I'm going to include a segment talking about the relative strengths and weaknesses of the deck, and then finally closing out with some potential ideas for what they could do to support this strategy in the future with more card releases. Yes, I am going to talk about a potential Great Daiyusha, because literally everyone ever is thinking about Great Daiyusha. With that said, I hope you guys enjoy. Now, kicking out the ride line, we're going to start with the Grade 0 Dimensional Robo Goyusha. Now, unlike with some ride lines, this is actually a mandatory include, and that's because Daiyusha himself comes with an effect that requires Goyusha for a specific cost, so you must run him no matter what. As for the skill, well, it's just the general starter skill. If you went second, you draw a card. Now we're going to move on to Dimensional Robo Dailander, who's the grade 1 of the ride line. Of course, you play Energy Generator. We don't need to bring that up because DZ's been out for a while, ladies and gentlemen, so we got to keep up with the times. It is the way of the future. Back to Dailander. So Dailander has two skills. The first one being a typical Brant Gate ride line skill, where when it's placed in the Vanguard circle, you search your deck for the set order of choice, which in this case is a base card, and you add it to the hand. This is kind of an interesting card for two reasons. One, it's already inherently a fascinating card, which we're going to talk about it in a moment because we need to understand how the set order operates in order to understand the general play pattern of the Dimensional Robos, but it's also technically a base card, which means it shares the same subtype as the base cards with Aegis, which is a B hero support card. That's really funny, but unfortunately we won't be able to utilize Aegis in this deck properly because it's name locked to its respective hero archetype. So, despite the opportunity being right on the wall there, we are not going to be receiving the sickest crossover film between heroes and Dimensional Robos. I know, sad days. Still, the secondary effect of Dailander is also quite interesting. See, auto when this unit is placed on rear circle from soul by your card's ability, if you have a Grade 3 or greater Vanguard with Daiyusha in his card name, all of your Vanguards in this unit gets power plus 5,000 until end of turn. This is informing us of the general play pattern of the D-robos, where you have all of your D-robos in your soul and then you play them out to the field almost like Pale Moon would. And by assembling them to the field, they're able to trigger their effects, which add to the overall strength of your offense as a whole. This is an interesting iteration of the general Dimensional Robo strategy where they would assemble the D-robos in the soul, but they actually stayed there in order to empower the Vanguard. In this case, it's the opposite. Rather than empowering the Vanguard solo, they all come out and play their part for a united front. And there are 6 differently named Dimensional Robos if you include Daiyusha as the Vanguard, so you can have a full field with a ton of different effects and kind of ways to attack the opponent. It's a very, very cool concept, and really illustrates this idea of heroes banding together with impeccable teamwork to take on the greater evil. Now, let me go over and segue to the Super Dimensional Fortress Daibase. This is the aforementioned base card that we'll be adding. Daibase is going to be a 4 of in the deck, and it's one of the best parts of this deck. It has 2 skills, which are both act skills. First off, act in the order zone if you have a Dimensional Robo Vanguard. Cost rest this card and energy charge 1. Choose up to 1 grade 2 or less card with Dimensional Robo in its card name from your drop and put it in your soul. If this card was put in the order zone this turn, however, you may search your deck for that card instead of choosing it from the drop and put it in your soul. If you search the deck, shuffle the deck. Secondly, act in the order zone. If you have a Vanguard with Dimensional Robo in its card name, cost Energy Blast 2 and rest this card. Choose up to one Great 2 or less card with Dimensional Robo in its card name from the soul and call it to rear circle. This card is both super powerful and super fascinating. Puns with the super, of course, totally intended. This card essentially lets you tutor out your D-robos into the soul from both the deck and the drop zone, and then deploy them to the field, which is sort of the aesthetical underpinning of this card, which is, if you watch a lot of mechas, then you know that they're sort of put into hangars or different loading docks, and then they fire off as they go to the battlefield. It's sort of like that. So you load your D-robos and then you deploy them. This is a very efficient system. Every single iteration of this card, because you can have up to 4 in your order zone, of course. Every single one will either be building you energy and soul, or you can utilize it for a really nifty plus to the field. Energy Blast 2 for a +1 is a very, very good bargain, because normally with your energy economy, it's Energy Blast 3 that translates to a +1 if you're utilizing something like your Energy Cycler cards or the new Festival Collection Grade 3s, which refund your discard, so on and so forth. Hell, Energy Blast 7 is also just the bare minimum for a plus anyway. So Energy Blast 2 for a plus of your choice from the soul is kind of a steal, not gonna lie, especially since these cards are going to be refilling it anyway. This makes Dimensional Robo into a sort of fascinating resource economy type of strategy, where you're constantly having to micromanage how much energy that you have remaining and how much you want to utilize on any given turn. So on some turns, you may be utilizing most of your fortresses in order to build up your energy for a bigger push later in true DP fashion, or you might decide this is the turn where I need field presence now, and then you just rest those suckers, energy blast a ton, and boom, you've got a whole board over again. It's a very impressive card and one of the backbones of the entire strategy. So when looking at the various effects of the Dimensional Robos, just imagine that this is the thing that's calling them from the soul. Now, moving back to the ride line, we move on to the Grade 2 Dimensional Robo Daidragon. Daidragon comes with 2 pretty nifty skills. The first one being, when this unit is rode upon by a Grade 3 card Daiyusha in its card name, call this card to rear circle. Secondly, auto. When this unit is placed on rear from the soul by your card's ability, if you have a Grade 3 or greater Vanguard Daiyusha in its card name, until the end of your opponent's next turn, this unit gets 5,000 power and the following ability. Auto on the rear circle, when your Vanguard is attacked, retire this unit, choose one of your Vanguards, and get power plus 15,000 until end of that battle. That is something to note. I switched the explaining of that effect a little bit because I want to emphasize that it gets 5,000 power on its own, as well as that red text skill, because it's really easy to forget that last bit and think it's just a 10k beater. No, it's a 15k beater at all times, as long as you call it from the soul, which does proc off of its own skill when called by riding over into Daiyusha. A very important note there too. This skill is not one of the more important ones of the Dimensional Robo arsenal, but it's very good, because not only do you lack a lot of card advantage in this strategy, meaning that every defensive piece counts, it has a very strong interaction against one of the BDIFs of the format, Vanguard Dragras. See, in Vanguard Dragras, with its skill, it's able to wipe out your front row, and it even has cards like Rokusei which prevent you from intercepting, meaning that you won't be able to get value off of your Grade 2s before they inevitably get retired by the Vanguard skill. Daidragon, thankfully, gives them the middle finger and dodges around the effect by being able to retire itself as a cost rather than intercepting in order to give yourself a 15k shield, effectively. It's a very strong effect for that particular matchup, but even in not that matchup, it's just a nifty little defensive bonus. Of course, in control matchups, this isn't really going to come into play because if they reach your cards, they'll know to snipe this guy first, but still, in non-control matchups, you'll be able to really let this guy shine. He's only a 1-of in the deck in the ride line because, as we know from the bases now, even when he retires himself, you can just recur into the soul and then subsequently to the field, as that is the general play pattern of the D-robos, so you only need the 1 in the ride line. Now it's time. Chojigen Katai Daiyusha! Yeah, boy. Oh man, I just had to do it. I just had to. It's so cool, man. Everyone cheered when this dude was released, especially Different Fight, but even though I'm not him, I'm still hyped as frick to talk about this card. So Super Dimensional Robo Daiyusha comes with 2 very impactful skills. The first one being auto on the Vanguard circle once per turn. When this unit attacks, cost Counterblast 1 and draw a card. If your opponent's Vanguard is Grade 3 or greater, choose any number of your units Dimensional Robo under different card names, and they get power plus 5,000 until end of turn. Note that that second part of the skill is locked behind the opponent's Vanguard being Grade 3 or greater, because we actually do have a superior right shenanigan in this deck, which is very much harkening to the old D-robo play line with Goyusha. The secondary skill is Auto on the Vanguard circle once per turn. At the end of the battle this unit attack costs, put a card from hand to your soul. Stand this unit and it gets drive -2 until end of turn. If your bind zone does not have a Dimensional Robo Goyusha and you Persona Road this turn, then cost bind a Dimensional Robo Goyusha from your soul, and this unit gets drive +1 till end of turn. See, that's why Goyusha is important. Anyway, talking over this card, this is a fairly impressive card, but not in a vacuum. It does give you a plus and a pretty hefty power bonus, which does incentivize you to play one of every different Dimensional Robo. As mentioned before, there are 6 total Dimensional Robo units, which include this guy, because it says unit rather than rear guard, meaning that when you have your optimal formation set, you get a grand spanking total of 30,000 power to your field. That's quite nice. Additionally, it is a beat stick that can go twice, but it has a detriment. See, by putting a card from hand to the soul but not getting any drives in return normally, you are effectively -1 in card advantage to get that extra attack. This is a little bit sad, because even decks like say Vanguard Dragras, to bring him up again, when it gets the -2 drive, it didn't have to neg in card advantage necessarily in order to do that. Hell, depending on the cards that you retire, you might be able just to recall them and maybe get even more pluses off of it. So this does come off as a little bit weak, but the reason why it's held back is because Daiyusha is a very fast strategy, capable of going to the grade 3 first before any other card in the game, with the exception of maybe Blonde Ezel. Because of that, they wanted to restrict it to where you couldn't beat up your opponent at maximum power yet, so not getting extra drives, which means no extra triggers, is a pretty good safeguard. Of course, they may have gone a little bit too ham by restricting the +1 drive to binding a Goyusha once per game, rather than just making it a Persona Ride thing. But still, the card is hyper impactful, and when you can get the Goyusha bind off, that extra drive could be very meaningful, especially, to reiterate, you don't have a lot of hand advantage, this restand skill being one of the reasons why, so you'll take everything you can get. But still, even if for just for that first skill, which is very fantastic plus and power up, overall, as a complete package, Daiyusha does hit the opponent's Vanguard pretty hard, and he's a fairly threatening unit, especially if you're able to hit some triggers off his initial drive checks. Now, moving on to the main deck in total, we're of course going to be running 3 extra copies of Daiyusha in the main deck. This is to ensure our Persona Rides, and as a matter of fact, Persona Ride is so important that we'll also be running Gratias Gradale as our choice of Regardless Piece. Now, Regardless Piece is a little bit of a touchy subject in this deck because it is a Brant deck, which means you'll want to be playing your bases instead of using this guy, but if it's between playing the extra base and being the only thing that gets you the Persona Ride, you're going to opt for the Persona Ride because you need to maximize your offensive pressure, and typically you want to end the game sooner rather than later because your lack of card advantage means that you won't be able to defend yourself properly as the opponent continues to scale. As a matter of fact, a lot of decks can outscale Daiyusha in the later game, particularly Stride deck sets, so when you're the bigger man on campus in the early game, that's when you want to maximize your benefits. So yeah, I am going to be running the Gratias Gradale, and I suggest you do too. Now, of course, we already have the 4 Daibases, we don't need to talk about that again, but moving on into more of the main deck units, we've got Super Dimensional Robo Dailady. She's our other grade 2 Dimensional Robo, and she's one of the cornerstones of the deck. She has 2 skills. Auto, when this unit is placed on rear circle, if you have a Vanguard with Dimensional Robo in its card name, you counterblast 1 and search the deck for a base card and put it in the hand. Yeah, it's as simple as it is. It tutors the base automatically. Of course, it doesn't put it in the order zone, which means you're still limited by the natural once per turn placement rule of orders. You can only play 1 at a time, and they did that on purpose. I'm sure of it, but it's still a very strong card. And one thing to note is because Dailady doesn't specify where she has to be placed, it's just on the rear circle. That means that you can tutor from the soul to the field and still trigger her effect to add another base card, and that's going to be one of the main combo bits that we're going to get into later when I explain more of the Dimensional Robos. It does have a secondary skill that makes it a good beater. Auto on the rear when this unit attacks a grade 3 or greater unit. If your order zone has 2 or more bases, this unit gets power plus 10,000 until end of battle. So yes, an automatic 4 of Staple. It searches out your base card, and it's the only one that's able to do it this consistently, so you'll want to run for that alone, but the 10k power up also means that it's the strongest rearguard attacker in the deck, so yeah, you go girl. As for other grade 2s, we've got one other to talk about, which is Bullet of Creation Pansmermia. Now, of course, we already know how cycle cards work. You can counterblast or energy blast 3 for their effects, and the main effect of note here is the effect to draw a card when you're discarding it from hand for riding, or when you're guarding from it from the hand. This is a very important skill because card advantage is quite lacking, but it's also a tricky skill to pull off because both Counterblast and Energy are very resource intensive aspects of the deck. You're utilizing a lot of energy gain and energy blasting from your set orders, so it's hard to measure how much energy you'll have to waste for Pansmermia specifically. On the other end of the spectrum, Counterblast is also a touchy subject. Daiyusha is counterblasting one every turn for its auto skill, well, the first one, and also you're counterblasting one for Dailady. And because you want to tutor out your Daibases as soon as possible, that means that your first couple grade 3 turns are going to be counterblast 2 turns most likely. This doesn't leave a lot of room for Pansmermia to operate and pay for its cost. Of course, the counterblast might be perceived as the easier condition, especially because we are going to be running a countercharger in this deck, and because it's Brand Gate, I think you guys know which one that is. But even so, there are situations where you don't have a lot of counterblast to give, especially because the low card advantage of the strategy means that you'll probably want to guard the early attacks as much as possible because those are the easy 1-card guards, rather than not have enough to guard the really huge, insane later attacks. But this runs counter to your need to counterblast a lot in order to get your game plan going and get some extra easy card advantage. So you're going to have to juggle that quite, I suppose, skillfully. Of course, energy is an option for Pansmermia, but again, you have to juggle that correctly. Now, of course, energy charging is something that's inherently a part of the Daibase strategy. If you're trying to rest them and not call to the field, then that gives you the ability to utilize the draw skill off of Pansmermia, but you need to decide when that is important and viable. Of course, we will be running another grade 1 that also energy charges 1, but when we get into that, I'll also explain why this isn't necessarily going to make Pansmermia the best thing in the world, but still, it does help quite a bit because of all the generic options in Brand Gate, there aren't really a lot that help Daiyusha more than a card like this. Because most Brand Gate generic support are all about either searching set orders or doing skills based off of the set orders that you have on the field or in the drop, particularly the grade of the ones on the field. This is quite tricky though because it's just a grade 0 set order. It's the only one of its kind, so only running one kind of set order, and you don't want it to go anywhere but to the order zone. It doesn't leave the order zone at all, like it's a meteorite card or something. So this means that a lot of the generic bulwark support, it isn't going to work for this deck, meaning that Pansmermia is, despite the difficulty in paying its cost, is one of the best generics that you could run in a deck like this. Now, moving on to the grade 1s, let's start by talking about the Dimensional Robo grade 1s. We got 2 more to talk about. First off is Dimensional Robo Daimariner. Daimariner has 2 skills. Auto, when this unit is discarded from hand during your turn, you may put this card in your soul. Secondly, when this unit is placed on rear from soul by your card's ability, if you have a grade 3 or greater Vanguard Daiyusha in its card name, this unit gets power plus 2000 and your opponent cannot intercept. The skill when placed from soul is probably the weakest of them because it's not a very significant power gain, and intercepting isn't something that your opponent is really want to do against your big numbers, but it can still come up depending on the nature of the intercepts that they're throwing out there. But of course the 2k is also somewhat useful because it gives you optimal boost numbers for Daiyusha. When you have a unit that you want to boost with Daiyusha, this is probably the one you're going to go for because 10k plus 13 is a magical number. Overall though, probably the most important part of this card is ironically the discard effect, because placing into the soul helps set up for your superior ride, which is initiated by the next card. Now Daibattles is probably the most important of the Dimensional Robo main deck units when it comes to your ride and also your pressure. Its first skill is Act in the Soul once per turn. If your Vanguard is Dimensional Robo Daidragon and your opponent's Vanguard is grade 2 or greater, and your soul has a Goyusha, a Dailander, and a Daimariner, keep in mind that means that you need to have the other D-robos aside from Dailady. Cost, put a card from hand in the soul, choose up to 1 Dimensional Robo Daiyusha from your ride deck, and write it as stand. Yes, that is an easy early ride. You can't do it if your opponent is grade 1, so all it means is that you're going to be going first no matter what, but that is still an incredibly powerful benefit that I'm going to break down in just a moment. Still, let's go into its second skill before that. Auto, when this unit is placed on rear from soul by your card's ability, there's that stipulation I was referencing. If you have a grade 3 or greater Vanguard with Daiyusha in its card name, and your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, that's important. Your Vanguard's original critical becomes 2 until end of turn. that is what I'm talking about when I say this is one of your most important pressure units. That critical is so crucial for making Daiyusha actually feel like the lethal boss he's supposed to be. So every turn, at bare minimum, if you need to call a D-robo to the field, you probably want to go for Daibattles first and foremost. Now, Daibattles is also nailing this early ride, and this early ride is super incredible because it's effectively guaranteed to you. Here's how your play pattern goes. So you're going to be riding up to grade 1, which is your Dailander. Dailander is going to add you a base. You play base from the hand. Base will be able to rest itself, and since it was played that turn, you'll be able to search for a card from the deck and put it into your soul. This could be either Daimariner or Daibattles. Daimariner we're going to get to in a second. Now, after you do that, on the next turn, let's say that you got a second base, either because you hard drew or you played a Dailady. You use that Dailady's effect, you get the base, you get the Daimariner or Daibattles, whichever one you didn't get first. I would recommend getting Daibattles in first and foremost, and then Daimariner second, because it's in order of importance. And then, because you've got Battles, Mariner, Goyusha, Lander in the soul, and then your Vanguard is Dragon, bada bing, bada boom, you have got everything you need for that superior ride to go off, baby. It is really that simple. It's an incredibly consistent skill. In fact, it's so consistent that we're only going to be running 3 copies of Daibattles and Daimariner. That's right, not all 4 copies, which may sound like blasphemy, but let me break it down for you guys. See, you only need to see 1 of each in order to get the Superior Ride engine going, and then from there, those same copies that helped initiate the Superior Ride can then be called out to the field of battle and get their effects off. From there, you can take those singular copies and cycle them back from the drop zone to the soul to the field. The only reason why I'm running more than 1 is that when you do have multiple copies seen, you can then put in the soul and overcall the originals, meaning that now by overcalling with the new version of, let's say, Daimariner, the old one will go to the drop zone, which can then be placed into the soul and then back to the field. So you have this cycle with your deployment so that you can keep refreshing their when placed from soul to rearguard circle skills. But you only need to see like 2 copies of each card to get that cycle going, and 1 copy of each card to get the initial ride and their initial benefits anyway. So having 4 of each is just taking up deck space, dude. You don't need to go that hard with their ratios, which is why 3 of each is the perfect number for me. Moving on to other grade 1s, we've got Silver Star Dragon Seyfert. This is a new one from the Festival Collection, so let me explain its skills. First up is Auto. When this unit is placed on rear circle, it can be from anywhere. If your Vanguard's grade is less than or equal to your opponent's Vanguard grade, you energy charge 1, and this unit gets power plus 2000 until end of turn. This is a really nifty energy charge. So nifty, in fact, that it's the main reason why we're playing it. By getting an extra energy, you can then utilize it to push yourself to the next threshold and get another plus off a base. It's that powerful. Of course, the secondary skill of Auto on the rear or drop when your other card is discarded from hand during your turn, cost energy blast to remove this card, choose one of the discarded cards to put in your hand. That effect is pretty nifty in concept, but in reality is not that useful for this deck, because aside from the early turns where you're discarding for the ride deck, you don't discard for anything else in this strategy, so it's not likely that this will pop up in most cases. Technically, you could discard off of Pansmermia on Persona Ride to search for a base, but aside from that, it's either early turn or bust for this particular skill, and it's not always a given that you'll even pay for it when it's an opportunity to do so, because Energy Blast 3 is still touchy, but that's exactly why we're using the Energy Charge 1. Furthermore, the plus 2k is pretty nifty. See, because it has the statement of the Vanguard's grade is less than or equal to your Vanguard's grade, that means that it's good if you're playing catch-up, but it's also not the best. It depends on when you do it. See, when you're going first, this skill isn't going to pop up because you'll be a higher grade than your opponent's Vanguard. But when you're going second, this thing really shines. So let's say you're going second on your grade 1 turn. You'll be able to call this as a 10k booster behind the Vanguard and swing for 18k. That means that your opponent cannot 1-card guard it and thus are most likely going to take that damage guaranteed. Then on the turn 2, if you're going second, and both Vanguards are grade 2, this guy can be a 10k attacker going into their 10k. Alternatively, if you're doing the superior ride like you should, that means that this guy can be a 10k booster behind like a Daidragon or something, which is a 25k attack. That's a magic number against a 10k Vanguard from the opponent. So its numbers have multiple timings in which it's useful. Hell, it can even be a 10k booster for your Daiyusha itself if you didn't call out Mariner. Maybe you didn't have the energy to call out Mariner, and Mariner is the least important of the calls from the soul because the intercept concept, and plus 2k is not that impactful in most scenarios. So this guy does have a lot of uses, but really those are just uses that are part and parcel with the Energy Charge 1, which is the main directive behind playing Seyfert in the first place. Of course, one last thing to know about Seyfert is the discard effect does have more synergy with another branch staple that you may want to play, which is Operation Master Freiheit. Now, Freiheit's skill is that you can counterblast and discard in order to add a Persona Ride copy to the hand, and as we know, Persona Ride is fairly important for Daiyusha. It has a skill locked behind that condition after all. But that isn't the greatest thing. See, yes, it does add Persona Ride, and yes, its discard does mean you can combo Seyfert. But the problem is that A, it counterblasts, which is a very touchy resource for this deck, as well as energy is already a touchy resource, so it's not like it's for free. The other issue with Freiheit is it's a card that stays on the field afterwards. And as we know, your optimal board setup is comprised of dimensional robos. Now, Seyfert gets a pass in a sense, especially because it does have a drop zone effect, but even Seyfert having to stay on the field afterward is a little bit sucky. But for something like Freiheit, which has like absolutely no value after the initial place, it's equally sucky. And hell, it's not as good of an attacker as both of your grade 2s anyway, so whereas Seyfert might be able to stay on the field for an extra turn if you don't call all the booster dimensional robos, there's almost no reason to actually keep Freiheit on the field aside from getting that Persona Ride copy, meaning that it's a counterblast 1 for a break even that you'll have to overcall anyway. It's not the greatest card in actual play, but if you do value getting the Persona Ride guaranteed to push for numbers and kill the opponent quickly, then Freiheit is a really good aggressive piece in order to just push for the endgame. But still, that's up to you. Personally, I didn't opt for it, but it is a viable strategy and does add more value to the Seyfert include. The final grade 1 is Detonation Monster Bobalmine. Now, Bobalmine is a staple of the clan ever since set 1, so we all know what it does. It goes from the soul and countercharges you 1. This has two purposes. Of course, the countercharge is the main payoff because counterblast is touchy, as I've said many times, but there is another bit that's kind of neat about Bobalmine, which is since it's going into the soul, it's leaving room for your other D-robos to be called to the field without having to overcall previously called units. So it is efficient in making space for the next call. I like that part of the interaction a lot. But overall, it's just here for the countercharge, and it happens to synergize in your attack patterns. Now, finally, before moving on to the triggers, I did say Bobalmine's the final grade 1, but we do actually play PGs, of course. The PGs can really be anything. You do plug the one Elementaria Sanctitude, of course, but as for the PG, it's just Fashion Guards. You pick what you like. I went with the Strogalmars because it's a D-robo looking unit, and this is D-robos itself, so I wanted to keep the aesthetic on point. As for your triggers, this is a little bit of an interesting debate, because although we are playing the normal 8 crits, where it gets interesting is in my front trigger decision. You can play fronts or you can play draws. Now, you may look at this and say, well, dude, you're saying you're having card advantage issues. Why not run draw triggers? And I would agree, I am having card advantage issues with this deck. But the front triggers are still the superior choice for me for 2 reasons. One, your attack patterns are optimal for front triggers. Normal attack pattern is you swing with Daiyusha, you skill, restand it, swing with it again, and then swing with your rears, right? That is your normal play pattern. That means if you hit a front trigger, you'll be able to get the benefit of that front trigger for 4 attacks in that turn. Of course, another aspect of front triggers that are superior to stand triggers is, sorry, not stand triggers, draw triggers, sheesh, I'm in a totally different headspace right now, is their 20k shield is superior to the draw trigger 10k shield. So even though you are drawing an extra card, which can help feed Daiyusha, there's no guarantee that what you draw is even going to be like a good card. Whereas the Enpyro, just by its own lonesome, is a hefty 20k shield, which is more useful than a 10k shield in this current format because there's a lot of hard-hitting units in this day and age. The offensive power creep has risen from the days of set 3 and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's why I'm going to go for the front trigger, but really draw triggers are an equally good debate in this scenario. You could go for either or and be perfectly fine with it. For heal triggers, I just went for normal heals. There's nothing really much to say here. I don't like effect heals. Moving on. For the OT, there is no debate. It's Eldobreath all the way. This is the strongest OT to date ever since the beginning, and in Dimensional Robos, this thing is equally as cracked, if not more so, because you have a restanding Vanguard that can dip into the Eldobreath benefit twice. And your Vanguards are not the only big thing in this deck, because your rear guards will also be fairly hefty, so you're going to get a really daunting OTK going if you land the Eldobreath on him. It's a very sacky win that will almost certainly kill when it's checked. So that's going to be the deck. In terms of strengths and weaknesses, let me go over the former and then the latter. One of the best strengths of Daiyusha as a deck is the superior ride. It means that it will never lose the die roll. Even if you have to go second, you're still going to theoretically go first because you're just going to put a card in hand and soul and go to grade 3 anyway. So you're not really beholden to whatever the whims of fate say your turn order is because your game plan will remain unfaltered no matter what. Another strength of this deck is its early game. Because you're going to grade 3 first no matter what, and you can assemble a really big field that has some pretty decent power lines to it, and also restanding Vanguard right off the attack, you can smash your opponent in the early game and deal a lot of damage. In a lot of the games where I play Daiyusha, the opponent is usually up to 4 or 5 damage before they even get to grade 3, which is a really bad position for them to be in, especially if you have the Persona right to maintain your offensive potential for the 4th turn. Another additional benefit of playing a strategy like this is because you can keep tutoring units from the drop to the soul to the field, you have a fantastic control matchup. If control units like, let's say, Varga Dragres, hell, even things like Gravidia, whatever is wiping out your units, you can simply rest your bases, put them into soul, and then put them back on the field like nothing happened. So although your hand advantage is not that great, your constantly recurring field advantage means that you can fight back against retire matchups splendidly. As a matter of fact, it's even somewhat of a symbiotic relationship with your strategy because it saves you the need of overcalling your units in the first place. So against control, yeah, Daiyusha definitely has an edge in that category. Also, because its really fast, high-octane nature is usually a good matchup against control strategies, but tend to want to delay the game for an extra turn to get their own game plan into volition, you may very well not give them that chance. So overall, there's a lot of good strengths to be had that way. In terms of weaknesses, card advantage, of course, is the number one thing. Not necessarily holistic card advantage, it's just hand advantage. You don't have a lot of things going in your hand, and one of the only things that goes go in your hand is a set order complements of Dailady. So your defensive potential is quite low. And again, another weakness of this deck is that because you're relying on either overcalls or also the opponent having a control matchup, you're not always able to reinitiate the effects of your D-robos when placed from the soul. And that's a problem because that means that you may not have your optimal board setup going every single turn, and this segues into potentially one of the saddest aspects of Daiyusha as a deck, which is that it has poor late game scaling. Usually its first and second grade 3 turns are the best you're going to get, and then from there it's difficult to maintain that same tempo and level of power. You're going to taper off, whereas most people are just now ramping up. And in that inverse relationship, you do feel like the king of the hill in the early turn, but if you're unable to kill them the first couple turns, your chances of winning the game are staggeringly lower than they were in the first couple of grade 3 turns. And that's an issue for the deck that may be mitigated with some future support. Speaking of which, let's talk about that future support. Now, as I alluded to near the beginning of this video, let's think about what a potential great Daiyusha would do. I think the real skill of a great Daiyusha would come down to sort of like in the flavor of the original, where you assemble all of your D-robos together for the great Daiyusha. But whether that be for a superior ride or not, I think it is a question that Bushi would have to answer. That would enable for an extra Vanguard multi-attack, making it 3 Vanguard attacks, again, like Varga Dragres, which is, it's crazy how often that unit in particular seems to be relevant as a point of comparison for Daiyusha. But yeah, you could suck in all of your units into the soul. And what's cool about that is not only would you do it for maybe like a really massive Vanguard swing with maybe some guard restricts or drives or stuff like that, but by sucking all of them into the soul, it saves you the need to overcall because you can then just utilize your bases to recall them back to the field. So in a way, it's already doing half of the process for you. Hell, you don't even need to put them from the drop into the soul if they're already in the soul, so all you gotta do is the energy blast to part of the bases. That's a really nice synergistic way of implementing a better finisher unit in Daiyusha, because although Daiyusha does smash in the early game, there's not any lethal elements of this card to close out games. It's just a very honest beat stick that goes twice. Another support card that I would like in this deck is something that adds more card advantage. Maybe it's a card that can Soul Blast out D-robo specifically in order to draw cards. That might be a cool idea because you always need their D-robos there, and your Soul Blast can be put back into the Soul by way of the bases anyway. You could also have some added element of lethality, like maybe there's a guard restrict that you can place on your Vanguard. One of the ideas, and I think a lot of people have been talking about this, is ways of taking Goyusha from the bind zone and throwing it back into the Soul. That way you can reutilize the Persona Ride skill to get a drive back. I think a lot of people are touching on that. I don't think they're going to do it because that would be bushy, basically shooting themselves in the foot with the restriction that I put in place. But if they do go for it, I can see maybe a promo card doing something like that. So those are a few of the ways that they could expand on it. Really, it doesn't need more things to emphasize on its strengths, except maybe a strong Great Daiyusha finisher. But it's more so just hedging in those weaknesses and making sure that it doesn't die to its shortcomings. Now, that was the deck profile. If you guys did like this deck profile, then do let me know down below what you enjoyed about it. And also let me know if you guys did get a chance to play it, what are the results, and if you guys think this deck profile is up to snuff. Also, if there are some suggestions for alternative cards to put in, aside from the Freiheit I mentioned, or maybe some criticisms on my deck ratios, do let me know. Again, I'm not a Brant Goon, and I'm not the Master Dimension Police, so this deck is definitely subject to criticism, but I do believe it to be, at the very least, good enough to present to the larger audience here. If you did like this deck profile, then go ahead and stay tuned to my channel for other deck profiles. I also do fight nights, anime reactions, tier lists, discussions, the whole shebang, so check it out. If you like what you see, consider leaving a subscribe and turn on the notification bell for the next time I upload a video. And with that said, take care, God bless.